on the 0 hour. I am, as is perennially the case, your host, Richard RJ Eskow. There's a lot going on in the news. I know we've just had an election. I know this transfer of power is insane. I know the economy is crashing. And of course, everybody's well aware of the COVID crisis. But on that last point, somehow, maybe it's just me, but I get the impression that as much as we're all extremely anxious and concerned about those skyrocketing rates of infection, somehow it feels as if we as a society and a lot of people as individuals haven't internalized what this might mean for the next several months in our lives. So what better reason to get back in touch with our good friend, Dr. MarkAlain Dery. MarkAlain Dery is a physician in New Orleans. He is an infectious diseases doctor who specializes in the negative impacts of poverty on health. He has been very involved on the front lines fighting this crisis. He is also, among other things, the founder of WHIV FM radio in New Orleans, which I'm proud to say carries this show. And he is a musician. We have partnered in that kind of enterprise as well. So without any further ado, Dr. MarkAlain Dery, welcome back to the 0 Hour.
Thank you so much, RJ, for having me.
Well, it's always great to talk to you, although admittedly, this is not a great thing to talk about. So I look at, there used to be cartoons that would show somebody trudging up a mountain and they get to the top and they celebrate, and then they see another mountain that's 10 times as large. And I've never found those particularly inspirational, but I have seen them. And I feel somehow as if that's what we might be looking at in the next several months. I'm not sure everybody realizes. To me, maybe the fatality rates are better, I'll look to you for guidance on that. But it seems to me that this, we had the first wave and this is the tsunami. Am I right about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the things that's been very typical of respiratory viral pandemics, so influenza 1918, the 1957 and 1968 influenza epidemics that happened, the H1N1 and the H5N1. So all of these respiratory viral illnesses, some of them that we saw in our own lifetime, 68 for me, and the H5N1 and the H1N1 as well, is that there's always been a second wave. Like there's always been a winter wave. And we've always kind of explained it as, well, either it's something about the virus, maybe as it circulates to the population, or obviously the easy one to think about is, well, it gets cold and people are more likely to be indoors and it's a respiratory virus. So you're more likely to have circulation of the virus because you're having more people indoors. But one of the things I want to add to that now, and I don't think anybody had thought about it before because none of us had really experienced a pandemic per se, which is I think that there's an element of fatigue, of pandemic fatigue as well. And as we start to move into Christmas and Thanksgiving time, we are going to see cases in February that are going to make us wish that we were back to where we are now. I fear greatly that we are going to, I would not be surprised if we saw cases at 200,000 daily, and if we started seeing 2,000 deaths a day, which is really, those are numbers that are coming out of my mouth that I don't even want to admit, and I hope that I'm wrong, but I believe that I won't be. The CDC just a couple hours ago, as of this recording, I don't know if you saw, updated their guidelines for Thanksgiving, and it just basically was, don't travel. That was their updated guidelines. And we know that as we start getting people together for Thanksgiving, you have about 40% of people who were surveyed said they are going to be going to homes and gatherings with possibly 10 or more. And 50% of those people said that they weren't planning on wearing masks. So we are going to see a national super spreading event that's going to be Thanksgiving, and that's going to crest right when Christmas time and New Year's happens. And then that ball of infection is going to then crest again at the end of January, going into February. And so those are grim predictions, but that's, I think, where we're going to be at right now. And then I just want to say too,
Sure.
and you probably know who said this, but and I don't know who it's attributed to. But that a death is a story, but a massacre or a pandemic is a statistic. The idea being that once these numbers start getting so large, people can't wrap their heads around it, and it almost seems as though that the human nature that we just stop thinking about it or stop being affected by it.
No, I think that's such an important point, MarkAlain, Dery, and I think, I always harken back to this. First of all, soon we will have reached 300,000 deaths, which is 100 times as many people as died on 9/11. So we changed our way of life. We spent trillions of dollars. The world turned upside down when 9/11 happened. 100 times as many people die, and half the country doesn't think we need to do anything. The other half is, well, at least politically, proposing semi-ineffectual, better than nothing, semi-ineffectual measures. And it seems to me that what you just said is part of it. The idea that we could put names and faces on the deaths in the World Trade Center more easily than we can with COVID. But the other thing, you and I care so deeply about health and saving lives. The other dimension of this is that, we, with the exception of a 9/11, we die individually. Even in a pandemic, we die in a hospital bed alone, with tubes and so on, or we die at home from, an undiagnosed case or what have you. We suffer independently in hospital beds or in homes. And I think there's that invisibility, that isolation that makes us incapable. The other thing I keep coming to, and I'm writing about this, so it's all in my mind, is, if a dirty bomb flattened Providence, Rhode Island, or all of Rhode Island, it would be the most shocking event in American history. But the death toll would be the same as what we're looking at now. So we just lack the empathic imagination to fully grasp what we're going through and what our neighbors and friends and loved ones are going through. That's my thought on it. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you is you don't just know the numbers, you understand the implications of this. I mean, this is still, if you get it, even if you survive, a lot of people are going through hell right now, aren't they?
Yeah, the post-COVID syndrome is terrible, and I'll definitely get back to. I want to get to that, but let me go back one.
Sure, please do. Yeah, direct me back if I'm.
No. It's I want to say it's such an important point that you're making, because this is exactly why with the military doesn't show the bodies returning home from war. It really needs to be punctuated. And when right before the pandemic happened, we snuck off to London to see the Clash's London Calling exhibit in the London Museum of Art. It was wonderful, right? And in that same museum, they actually had a bubonic plague exhibition. So I got to see the Clash London Calling exhibition, and then there was the bubonic plague exhibition, completely by coincidence. And so I went and started walking around and looking at the rendering of the time, and it was so dramatic the pneumonic plague that spread respiratory. Of course, this is a bacteria, and people were literally dying in the streets. There were bodies. Now, of course, this was a different time. Public health sentiment was obviously very different. There was no understanding of bacteria and viruses at the time, but people still were so responsive because people were dying so quickly and dramatically that they would die in the streets or in alleys or what have you, that there was always this constant reminder, and people were very careful during those days because of that. But it's such an important point that you do bring up, that invisibility is one of the reasons why it's not obviously, an airplane, something as dramatic as something like that. It is that being alone and being invisible. And again, to the human psyche, this is why they don't show bodies returning home anymore like they did in Vietnam, because people were in the streets as a result of that. So I just really want to underscore that important point. Post-COVID syndrome. So what scares me most about COVID? I'll tell you the two things that scare me the most. One is COVID-22. So we can talk about that in a moment if you want, because we have not done anything different as a species. The same things that have put us at risk for COVID-19 are still the same things that could put us potentially at risk for COVID-22. And that's basically deforestation, more interaction with these fruit bats that do not like interacting with humans. They want to stay far away from humans as possible. But there's an estimated 40,000 potential viruses that could become zoonotic, and that is that could flip and infect human beings. And these viruses are RNA viruses. So what does that mean? RNA versus DNA. Well, DNA, we're made out of DNA. Mammals are DNA organisms. They're very stable when they replicate. They replicate in a very stable fashion. The integrity of that DNA remains intact. But RNA organisms, when they replicate, there's no proofreading mechanisms. So they're very plastic. So they can adapt to new ecological niches very, very quickly. And that's how these RNA viruses are able to do what they do. So there's 40,000 of these potential viruses that are living in fruit bats. So that's one thing that scares me about COVID. The other thing that scares me about COVID are these post-COVID syndrome. Now, you've probably heard of these so-called long haulers, right? These are folks that experience like a chronic fatigue-like syndrome as a result of having COVID. And it looks like chronic fatigue syndrome. And what we know of chronic fatigue is that it stimulates your immune system such to the point that when your immune system is stimulated, you become all your energy, your body's ATP, which is the packets of energy your body uses, get shifted into fueling the immune system, and people are fatigued as a result of that because they can't capture those calories. They're being spent on running the immune system. People have chronic, they call it a brain fog, so it affects the central nervous system. They're having headaches, chronic debilitating headaches, anxiety, depression. There's scarring of the lungs that can happen, and we don't know what that looks like over long periods of time, but we can see it on imaging. The other thing that we can see on imaging is inflammation of the heart, which is called myocarditis, that could lead to heart failure called cardiomyopathy. We don't know. We're seeing young athletes having these conditions. And then very recently, we're starting to see that that COVID is getting into testicular tissue as well. And at least in one case was the cause of infertility in one male. So when folks say that this is a benign disease, I'm like, no. We're not even out of the pandemic. We need to wait 2, 3, 4 years and then look backwards to see how much damage was done, because we actually have no idea.
And, one of the reasons, and again, we're talking with Dr. MarkAlain Dery, infectious diseases physician, among many other things. One of the reasons I brought up the long haulers, or whatever we want to call them, in this post-COVID syndrome is I keep kind of probing the zeitgeist for ways to get people more energized about addressing this. And a lot of people are, to be fair. But one of them is, look, if you can't picture the death, maybe you can picture, Mr. and Ms. America, what it would be like to have to live this way, because, it must be absolutely awful, depressed, exhausted, unable to think, not knowing when it was going to end, potential heart problems, potential testicular, you name it. And, I think we're all probing around for something, for a way to respond as a society to something that was inevitable, but we never planned for. So, a physician, which you are, of course, is also an educator. And, how is it going for you? I don't know how much frontline, I know initially you were doing a lot of frontline medicine around this issue. I don't know how much you're doing now, but if you are, you're in Louisiana. How are people responding? How receptive are they? How well do they understand the problem and what they might be up against?
So it depends on where in Louisiana we are. So sometimes I forget I live in Louisiana. I'm actually in New Orleans, right? And New Orleans is very, very different from the rest of Louisiana. So in New Orleans, we are just starting to see the uptick of cases that the rest of the country has been experiencing. We've had an amazing response by our mayor, an amazing response by the health commissioner. I've been fortunate enough to be on task forces along with some of the most brilliant other public health officials and professionals. And they've been very receptive, and they've been very progressive with the way that they've been managing the epidemic or the pandemic. But it's just now starting to hit New Orleans. It's the rest of the state has been on fire. Right before I got on air, there was a headline that is looking that the CDC is now urging Louisiana to start to snap back into phase 2 because the cases are going up so dramatically in Louisiana. So outside of New Orleans and outside of East Baton Rouge, you have a lot of folks that think that the virus and the pandemic doesn't exist. They've a lot of issues regarding fake news, not wanting to mask, this sort of stuff. So this is why outside of New Orleans, all through Louisiana, you have all these pockets of cases. In New Orleans, we've been really good. I would say it's been difficult because this city is a city that's based on tourism and it's based on entertainment, right? So music, restaurants, eating, food, drinks, bars, this sort of stuff. All of that has been, for the most part, has been completely shut down. But there's been a lot of really positive responses from all people who understand what's going on. A lot of these folks are gig workers. They were able to tap into some of those monies that, as we now recognize, are going to expire at the end of December, the day after Christmas. And so that's going to really infuse a lot of pain. But for the most part, people have been really, really good here. We're starting to see an uptick in cases. We're starting to see an uptick in hospitalizations. And when you see an uptick in cases and hospitalizations, you're going to see an uptick in death as well. That's a lagging indicator, and we expect to see that very soon.
And again, we're talking with Dr. MarkAlain Dery about the COVID-19 epidemic. In a sense, there's that line you always hear in movies, right? Which is, I've been training for this all my life, and here we are. You're an infectious diseases physician. You've studied epidemiology. I have a great interest in epidemiology as well. We have public health. You were, in Africa for some of the, at least one of the epidemics there. And here we are, right? So as we know, when we're talking about epidemiology, when we're talking about public health, when we're talking about addressing an issue of this, it's not just a matter of getting a vaccine created, finding the right treatment. It's not just a matter of technology. As critical as that is, it's a social problem, it's a cultural problem, it's an economic problem. It's so multidimensional, which is why in better times, it's always been a great interest of mine. But here we are, and we have, as you mentioned earlier, the vast majority geographically of your state is denying the existence of this. At least half the country, give or take, is doing the same. I would say there's another chunk, even where I live in Washington, D.C., that although it's much smaller, that is, I would say, passive aggressive about it. They think they can sort of negotiate with it. They know it's there, but they think, well, I can leave the mask off, walk in and out of the, so you have all these varied responses that range from, we get it, we understand the science, we stay up to date, we understand masks help us as well as others, range all the way from that to a kind of gut level, you're not the boss of me. This is just another way the government is infringing on my liberties, and I'm not going to let you do it. In the words of my mother, my late mother, if I told you not to jump off a bridge, would you do it? Just to show that you could do what you want. So we're up against that. Now, I don't know what your current thinking is. I mean, I think about this each and every day. What's your current thinking on how to address the social and cultural dimension of resistance to doing the right thing here?
So you mentioned that I was in Africa. I've been very fortunate to work in several pandemics and epidemics in Africa. The most recent was working with the World Health Organization for the Ebola epidemic, where I worked as a clinical epidemiologist. My job was basically tracking down cases and getting folks into the hospital, making diagnoses in the field, that sort of stuff. And so I was in some very high-level I was right there from the beginning. We were and as a WHO worker, I was able to attend these very high level meetings. And the first focus was on misinformation. The government focused very, very strongly. So in Sierra Leone, you have it. I was in Sierra Leone. I was in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and Sierra Leone, like the other some of the other West African countries, Guinea and Liberia, have very, very high rates of illiteracy. Sierra Leone particularly has an 80% illiteracy rate. So when you have an illiteracy rate that high, you have folks that it's very easy for folks to kind of, theories that we would call conspiracy theories move very quickly, there because it's something to latch onto. You don't understand viruses are hard to see, that sort of stuff. And so there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and the government forcefully came down and worked. It had these brilliant messaging in ways that people could understand, because again, high illiteracy rates, so billboards made sense to people who could look at pictures and that sort of stuff. So that was the first thing that folks did. Then the second thing is that they literally went out into the communities and supplied stuff for people. So my job was putting people into quarantine. When I found cases, I had to quarantine or isolate folks for 14 days or even longer, 21 days, what have you. And so they would provide food, they provide provisions. I would go in, how many people are in this compound? Oh, there's 8 people plus 2 babies. So we would make sure that food was delivered every day, and it was encouraging people to stay indoors. My brother is a musician in Germany, and he gets a check every month from the German government so that they are paying him to stay indoors. And so if I look at that sort of stuff, and he's a musician, right, is that if we had seen something like that here early on, had there been a unified voice, and I've been on here several times, especially in the beginning, saying, my goodness, there's no lack of centralized messaging. Now that's going to change here very soon. And as a quick little aside, Richard, it's going to be really fascinating. And I wish that it wasn't like this. I wish that we didn't have this, but we are going to see a natural experiment occur. What happens when there's no public health intervention, or you leave it up to 50 states to figure it out themselves, versus what happens when you actually have strong public health intervention in the form of this new advisory committee that's being formed by the President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris. So the lack of a coordinated message, the leaving it up to 50 states, the early messaging that President Trump, like this morning I was out on a run and I just got frustrated again that we could have avoided what we saw in New Orleans after listening to that phone call that President Trump had with the author Bob Woodward, and you could hear the tape in late January that he knew how bad this was. We didn't know in February when we had Mardi Gras, when we hosted something like several million people from outside of New Orleans, all over the world, come to New Orleans, and then predictably 2 or 3 weeks later, boom, we had huge increases in cases, and it took us until well into May, early June for us to control all that. So the lack of a coordinated voice. And then we had some of the messaging we heard from the Jared Kushner, who said it's not our responsibility to supply PPE. That attitude where you now then had your governor, the governor of Maryland, who had to lean on his wife's contacts, if I remember correctly, to get masks or PPE or this sort of stuff delivered specifically to Maryland. And you have 50 governors that are all bidding on ventilators. That's not the way that you have a response to a pandemic. That's completely unheard of. And this will go down in history, and there will be books, dissertations, classes, movies, academic studies of how bad it was, and then how different it's going to be with a new administration that's going to use really good public health principles to move us forward and finally get us out of this conundrum that we're in. It didn't need to be this bad. And let me just say, there will be a day reckoning. I predict there will be a day reckoning when people find out in 3 years, 4 years later, as people start becoming aware, maybe they're starting to have pulmonary issues, maybe they're having some cardiac issues. And when it becomes clear that had we done this, then we may have prevented that. Once people realize that they were in that group, I think that people are going to start getting very, very frustrated. But oftentimes it takes a couple years for that to come out.
And Dr. MarkAlain, Dery, I hope there is a reckoning. And, one of the things I was thinking about when you were speaking is that I think we've talked about this, I'm not sure, but I was in South Africa reporting on the AIDS crisis there. And there, as in half,
wow, what a job.
It was
it was, that's still, Richard, to this day, it's still that way. It's still that way to this day.
I saw things, that are tough to describe. And I spent a lot of time in the hills in KwaZulu-Natal, in the villages there. And to me, the parallels between South Africa and AIDS, and for lack of a better term, red state America and COVID are compelling. First of all, I'd love your thoughts on it. First of all, you had a government that spread misinformation and falsehood and pseudo cures. I was there some years ago, so it's changed. But so that was the central response. Secondly, you had what, for lack of a better term, might be called a religious establishment. In this case, of indigenous religious leaders, for whom I normally have a lot of sympathy for the culture and the society and the things that they've learned and passed down over generations, but in this case were profoundly resistant to medical interventions. You had people who didn't want, men primarily, who didn't want to know they had it, and you had also some terrible things happen because of folk beliefs about how it could be cured.
Yes, terrible. That's what you're referring to. I know who you're referring to.
I wouldn't, without some sort of major trigger warning, I wouldn't even be able to discuss it on the air. But so you had all of those. And here in the United States, what have we had since the thing began? A central government that spread falsehoods and stories about bleach and what have you. You have a religious establishment or a certain subset of our religious world that says armies of angels are going to get rid of this. You have people who believe it's a conspiracy to oppress, exactly as they did in South Africa, and the death toll there, as here, has been terrible and unnecessary. So I'll just put a slight burden on you, MarkAlain, Dery, and say, okay, how do we fix that?
Well, I do want to remind you that our response, by our response, I mean the United States' response to HIV in the 80s was not unlike that. In fact, if you look at the Reagan's response to HIV, it was not unlike what we saw with Trump. It was ignore it. It was pretend that it's going to go away. I mean, think about this analogy. The early HIV epidemic of the 80s affected disproportionately for biological reasons, but the gay men who have sex with men, IV drug users. And then it was later, when it was the hemophiliacs, that you started to have a little bit more of a sympathetic perspective from the president. So the men who have sex with men and IV drug users were not constituents, or it was not a population of folks. It just seemed like that people were interested in the 80s in responding to. And of course, I 100% disagree with that. I think that's criminal, of course. But it wasn't until you had this young boy named Ryan White, who was 15 years old, who got kicked out of his high school. You know the story, RJ, in Indiana, just because he was a hemophiliac. He got a factor VIII treatment. The way hemophilia is a bleeding disorder, so you have to get a monthly infusion, or maybe it's a little bit more common than that. But it basically gives you the factor that's missing in hemophilia, so that you don't bleed out if you cut yourself in one way or another, if you hit your head or what have you, you bleed internally. So he got. So you have a whole generation of hemophiliacs that were affected by HIV because the HIV virus got into that bloodstream, right? And so it was then that Reagan then first said the words HIV right at the end of his presidency, really in 1987, and it was in response to this 15-year-old boy who had hemophilia. So we largely ignored HIV in this country as well. And if we even go back even further, maybe topic for another conversation, because I think the analogy works as well, is that if we look at what happened with Tuskegee as well, you had a bunch of men that had syphilis. The government public health service went to go study them. Okay, that's all good. It wasn't until about 20 years later or so that penicillin had come out as the definitive cure for syphilis. It still is to this day. In fact, this clinic has penicillin in it because I still see so much syphilis, right? They refused to give these men syphilis. They were all men. Some 200 plus men penicillin for their syphilis. And to a large degree, what we see with the HIV epidemic and what we see with the coronavirus epidemic is the same thing. There is a lack of intervention. And I think that this speaks something very deep into the zeitgeist of the American culture or American society. And I think that we need to have our own day of reckoning as a society to recognize that this is who we are and that we need to do better moving forward, because we had unacceptable deaths that happened with the Tuskegee. We had unacceptable deaths that could have been prevented with HIV, and the enormous amounts of deaths. Like you said, it would not be surprising if we're up to 300,000 by February or March, and that is just unacceptable. We are rapidly approaching the levels of Civil War and then ultimately World War II, and so it has been criminal what's been happening so far.
And I remember in the Ryan White case, all of a sudden people were talking about innocent victims of the AIDS epidemic, which is a horrifying phrase if you ponder it, because it implies that those who are not 15-year-old children or whatever are somehow guilty and deserving of their fate. So hopefully we'll come to a point in our society where we recognize that illness is not a punishment, cure is not a gift, it's an obligation we have to one another. And along those lines, I'm always inspired by your work and your thinking. So Dr. MarkAlain Dery, as always, thanks for everything you do. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero.